Welcome to the YU Library's Spring Book Talk series. This talk will be moderated by Dr. Jeffrey Gurock, an internationally recognized expert in American Jewish history, as well as the Libby M. Klaperman Professor of Jewish History at Revel. We will raffle off 2 copies of the book. The lucky winners will receive an email in the next few days. Information about purchasing the book will be discussed later on. And now, please turn your attention to Dr. Gurock.
Well, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. It's really a pleasure to welcome a friend of long-standing, Len Grunstein, to this symposium, and a new friend, Farley Weiss. Both of them have done important work in the Jewish community. Len is an attorney and banker. He's the founder of Project Ezra. He's on the board of Revel, and as far as being on the board of Revel, he's a unique board member. Not only is he a supporter of scholarship, but he's a scholar himself, as we will presently see with this book. Farley Weiss, also an attorney. Both of them bring legal expertise to this important topic. Former president of National Council of Young Israel, chair of the board of Israel Heritage Foundation. And in fact, just for a minute or so, could both of you talk a moment about these organizations that you're part of? Farley, say a few words to our group about the Israel Heritage Foundation, and then Len, perhaps talk a little bit about Project Ezra. So Farley, the floor is yours for a couple of minutes, and then we'll move right into the book, which is an important historical history text, which is more than just the story of the successful movement of the embassy to Jerusalem, and we'll get to those details as we go along. So welcome, Farley Weiss, to Yeshiva, or back to Yeshiva University. You're a long supporter of this institution, and a few words about the Israel Heritage Foundation, if you don't mind.
Sure, no problem. By the way, I have 2 kids who graduated from Yeshiva University in Stern, a 3rd kid that's a junior at Stern, and a 4th kid who's in Yeshiva in Israel, going to be at Yeshiva University coming up. So we have a lot of support for Yeshiva University. And I was also, by the way, I worked as a clerk for Menachem Elon at the Supreme Court in Israel in the summer of 1988. And so I've been an attorney for a long time, and I've been involved with a lot of political stuff involving with the Jerusalem Embassy Act in 1995 with Senator Kyle's office, and worked with his office, and that's what helped lay the foundation for the book. And currently I'm with the chairman of the Israel Heritage Foundation, in which we are building relationships with major politicians, including we just had an event yesterday with former President Trump at Mar-a-Lago, and we had a previous event with him in Bedminster, thanking him in July, which I spoke at, for his moving the embassy to Jerusalem, its recognition as the capital, and other politicians that we've met on both sides of the aisle to build more intimate settings where you can speak to the politicians and help influence them on issues of concern to the Jewish community. And concerned also about the welfare of, like we just did a tweet today about the synagogue in Tunisia that was burned down, and speaking out for the safety of the Jewish people and fighting anti-Semitism.
Thank you very much, Len. A few moments about your career.
I'm a recovering attorney and banker. I've been involved in a bunch of great organizations, including Revel, which is one of the great institutions of Jewish learning in the world. Project Ezra was a charity that was begun during the financial crisis in the early 90s, when a lot of people were out of work. It had a very interesting beginning because the shul at the time was putting people who no longer had insurance, health insurance, through their employment because they weren't employed, on the shul policy until there came a point in time when they couldn't do it anymore. So I remember my co-founder coming to me, was Erev Yom Kippur, and saying, Len, you know, all these people are about to get news, Erev Yom Kippur, that they're no longer going to be insured. I said, no, they're not. We're going to pay for it, at least for the next few months, and then we'll figure it out. And that was the beginning of Project Ezra. And it's become a fixture of the community in Bergen County, and it helps a lot of people. One of the most amazing parts is philosophically, it doesn't do the maximum, which will hurt the self-respect of the individual. It seeks to do the minimum, in order to preserve self-respect. And in that sense, it's built lives instead of destroying lives. So it's a very unique charity, and thank the Lord it's been successful. And maybe one day it will be so good it will put itself out of business.
Sounds great. These gentlemen have written a very fine history book, rich in detail, bolstered by documentation, and they've brought their legal expertise to this important topic. But before we launch into the period 1995 to the present day, this book, I want to tell you, this book really charts 100 years of U.S. Israel, even before there was an Israel, diplomatic and political history. So I think we should start with a history lesson about the precedents that are supporting this idea. The book starts, of course, with biblical references to our connection to this land of Israel that was given to us. But more importantly, it talks about the friends and enemies the Jewish people have had, or Israel has had, over the long time. And I wonder if maybe Len can start by talking a little bit about the relationship of the Zionist movement, starting with over 100 years ago now, with Lord Balfour, 1917 Balfour Declaration, and some of the legal precedents that undergird what you folks were doing in the late 20th century. Could you share? And that it's all documented in this book, and it's a great read. I wonder if you can share a few moments just walking us through the Balfour Declaration, the movement towards the state of Israel, some of the diplomatic history that undergirds this book. Len, if you don't mind.
Thank you. The story begins, of course, prior to Balfour, but Balfour was an important milestone because it sets out Britain's view that the Jews were, in effect, the indigenous people of Israel. They had a right to reconstitute the ancient land of Israel, and therefore it talked about a national home. The word national as an adjective is very important because it distinguishes it from all the other people that have inhabited Israel over time. Jews have always been there, but of course we were exiled. And so a good portion of the Jewish people are all over the world. But there was always a continuous Jewish presence in Israel, and it recognized that Jews ought to have a right to come back. And that became the theme after winning World War I of the Allies. And so at the peace conference beginning in Paris in 1919, there were discussions because remember Wilson, when we studied American history, we learned about Wilson's view that people ought to have the right to govern their own affairs. And so they created out of empires, out of the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a bunch of countries. Now, this wasn't done haphazardly. At the peace conference, the Supreme Council met with all sorts of committees from various countries and heard their claims. And so they reformed, for example, Poland. They created Czechoslovakia. They created Hungary. They created Romania. They created all sorts of countries that today we take for granted in Europe, but at that time they had been lands within the empires. They also began to talk about the Ottoman Empire, which today we know its center is Turkey, but it really controlled a good chunk of the Middle East. And they began meeting in Paris, and then they later adjourned to San Remo in Italy. So in 1920, the Supreme Council was in Italy, meeting with delegations from all over the Middle East. One of the important ones was Hussein from Saudi Arabia. Sheriff Hussein came with a delegation. There's famous exchanges of correspondence with Chaim Weizmann, for example, but also, very interestingly, in 1919 in Paris, there was an exchange of correspondence with Felix Frankfurter in the US, talking about how he respected the rights of the Jews to Israel. He liked their support because he wanted Syria, all sorts of areas So those presentations, for the most part, were made in 1920 in San Remo. The Jewish delegation also made a presentation. There was also another Arab group from Syria who laid claim to Israel, saying that administratively in the Ottoman Empire, Damascus had controlled the entire area, including the area that they called Palestine, which we call Israel. And the Supreme Council, which included Great Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and the United States, these were the winning side in World War I, heard all the claims, and as the minutes reflect, they decided in favor of the Jews, and they didn't view it as creating a new state, but they viewed as recognizing the historic and legal ties of the Jewish people to the land of Israel and reconstituting a national homeland in the land that they denominated the territory of Palestine, because that's what they called it. But that was the land of Israel. And they also put a number of provisions in that were later affirmed unanimously by the League of Nations in 1922, which granted a mandate to Britain to accept all the people from all over that would come and live in Israel. In fact, they were required to do a nationality law just for Jews. Jews from anywhere in the world who took up residence between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea were entitled to nationality and citizenship in the new nation that was created there. Very interesting.
Help me understand where Faisal and Transjordan come into any of this discussion.
Okay.
Because Faisal is in Saudi Arabia. His group is not indigenous to what they would call Palestine, or we call Palestine, till 1948. It's almost as if you had a group of Jews who were known to be part of the Zionist movement, and the allied nations are looking around for someone who they can work with to support what they would call Arab claims. Am I off base on that, or?
No, in fact, Faisal, in his exchange of correspondence with Weizmann and with Felix Frankfurter, said to them, look, you support me, I want to get Saudi Arabia, I want to get Syria, and I will support you. It's interesting that when the actual test came, he didn't so much as support them as not lay claim to Palestine. And he said, we can put that on the side. We'll figure that out later. The Syrians, though, wanted Palestine. However, when the mandate was granted ultimately to Britain in 1922 by the League of Nations, there was a carve-out. And the carve-out allowed Britain to separate land that was east of the Jordan River, which we know is Transjordan, and award that separately. There was actually a provision that said the land of Palestine from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea could not be given to anybody else other than the Jewish people. So they were forbidden to do anything with that. Now, what happened was Faisal tried, Sheriff Hussein tried to get Syria. He took it over for a little while. That was a French protectorate, as you remember. And what happened is he was eventually thrown out because the people didn't want him. So as a consolation prize, the British gave him Transjordan because he was loyal to Britain. So Transjordan became Jordan. Abdullah, one of the children, eventually took over and became king of Jordan. And so Martin Jordan was formed. And that occurred actually legally at the same time that the UN recognized Israel in the partition resolution of 181 about the same time. So they were both recognized about the same time, even though Abdullah had been in charge for a while with the Jordanian legion that was actually officered by British officers. And so that was the consolation prize that he got instead of Syria.
Okay, I wanted to ask the following question. The United States never affirms the mandate because we never vote for the Versailles Treaty. We're an isolationist country. What's your sense of America back in the 20s and 30s, before the rise of Hitler, as far as Jewish presence, legal presence in Palestine? Can you offer some thoughts on that?
Fabulous question and little known history. In fact, often ignored history. It's very colorful. What happened is America didn't approve the League of Nations because of the isolationist movement.
Right.
So the U.S. was not a member of the League of Nations, so they had no say in Israel, but they wanted a say, and the British wanted them to have a say, and they wanted to have an understanding because they both had interests in Israel. And so they entered in 1924 into a treaty called the Anglo-American Convention. And this is, the Senate approved it. It was signed by the president. And so we have, as a matter of US law, under our Constitution, a treaty that's approved by the Senate and signed by the president is something that becomes US law. It adopted everything that was in the League of Nations affirmation of San Remo. So San Remo is repeated 3 times in the original San Remo resolution, affirmed by the League of Nations unanimously. US is not a member. It enters into a separate treaty with Britain in 1924. And that treaty adopts everything that's in the League of Nations resolution. So actually, as a matter of US law, little known and hardly ever referred to, any Jew anywhere in the world who comes to Israel, anywhere between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, has a right under US law, recognized under US law, to nationality and citizenship.
Which goes back to what year are you saying? Just
that was 1924.
1924. I
Now,
believe
every president,
the United States Congress has hearings on this issue around that time, and the overwhelming opinion of the United States Congress, although not a legally binding statement, is support for Jewish sovereignty within the boundaries of the League of Nations.
Yes, that resolution occurs around 1922. It's
Right.
of both houses, a joint resolution, and President Harding joins in, and he issues a beautiful statement. In fact, every president from Wilson to and including Roosevelt, and of course we have the seminal role played by Harry Truman, but every president issued statements confirming the support of a Jewish state of Israel. It's interesting that Wilson called it the Jewish Commonwealth. Very nice term. President Roosevelt in 1944, a fascinating thing occurred. In 39, remember, the white paper was adopted by the British.
Right.
Majority of the Foreign Affairs Committee in Congress, 15 out of 25 members, wrote a letter to the Secretary of State saying, how dare they? Under our treaty, they can't do that without our consent. And we never consented. So you tell them they can't do the white paper. Jews have to have a right to immigrate to Israel. Anywhere in the world, they can come to Israel. That's the homeland. And they have citizenship rights because it's a national home. And FDR in 44 acknowledged that, a little bit late, but acknowledged that and took Britain to task as well, saying you had no right to do the white paper.
Well, how about our friends in quotation marks in the State Department over the long delay here, their position while this is going on in Congress and also with the President of the United States? Is it already the question of oil? Is it anti-Semitism? Is it Arabists? What's your sense? Maybe Farley wants to join on this, or you can.
Yeah, I think one of the important things that Len brought up was that the recognition was from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, which means all of Judea and Samaria. It means all of Jerusalem. is recognized under US law. It's not just a statement, and the statement started with Teddy Roosevelt as well, supporting a Jewish right. So it was 5 US presidents in the late 18, 19, all the way through the 20s and 30s, supported the Jewish state, but it's also a US law and a treaty, and the treaty has never been changed. So that's the US law today that's been ignored up through by Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, just recently, ignoring what US law says about the Jewish right to recognizing the Jewish right to Israel and to all of Judea and Samaria and all of Jerusalem. And the State Department, as you know, opposed the US recognition of Jerusalem. When Truman decided to do that, there was the famous debate with Clark Clifford and Marshall. And Clifford, in the debate, which we talk about extensively in the book, he says that he makes the argument that it's good for US interests to have a democracy in the Middle East. And Marshall, this famous Secretary of State, who threatened to quit if Truman was to recognize Israel and then didn't go forward with that, he actually, he and his assistant, they started talking like anti-Semites about it and opposing it.
What's the motivation? What's the motivation? Just anti-Semitism, or is
Part
it
of it, love it.
supporting the Arabs, oil? What's going on here?
It was a
I have to
combination.
think that, historically speaking, our access to State Department officials, apart from the person who is nominated and confirmed by the president, these are career diplomats who've never had much sympathy for Jews, and this goes to Holocaust stories and pre-Holocaust stories. There's a long history of as much as we can talk about the presidents of the United States, the fact of the matter is that the State Department officials have had so much to say about the issue that you're talking about. Would you care to comment on that?
We had the benefit of a bunch of files being declassified. So we're among the first to go through the classified files. And it's frightening, the duplicity. It was a combination of the so-called Arabists, but many were just outright anti-Semites. They had all sorts of classic tropes that they invoked. For example, in the meeting with Truman and Clark Clifford, Lovett, who was there as the State Department old hand helper to General Marshall, started to talk about how they're all commies. And they're all coming from Russia, and they're going to be pro-Russia, not pro-America. Of course, that was foolish talk. Any Jew who's been in Russia, you can almost count on them to be anti-communist, given their experience. I can tell you my mom would be the first to say, what, communist? She used to teach me two things, God forbid if the Russians ever came. She goes, whatever they ask you, answer Napanya, which means I don't know. If they ask you, how much is 1 + 1? I said, Ma, 2. She goes, no. 1 + 1, your answer is, how much do you want it to be? So the Jews were not commies. There were always some.
Well, to be fair, there was a relationship between the Palestinian Jews and the Soviet Union. There's a long socialist tradition in Palestine, now Israel. So that is something that enemies of ours could glob onto.
All true, but then they extend that to the trope of, therefore, they're anti-American and pro-Stalin. They weren't pro-Stalin, they weren't pro-Soviet Union, they were socialists, that's true. And they turned out to be, as we all know from real life, one of the best allies the United States has anywhere in the world because of our shared interests, and more importantly, our shared values. And the result is the US has an ally, and that's what Clark Clifford said. They kept on accusing him of pandering to the Jewish constituency in America, claiming it was all domestic politics. And Clifford took offense. And they really were criticizing Truman and saying he's pandering to the Jews. Clifford said, no, this has nothing to do with domestic politics. This has everything to do with the United States national interest. And it's in our national interest to have a democracy in the Middle East that we can rely on. And so he put to bed that nonsense. Truman did something amazing at the time. in being the first to recognize Israel, and also to undoing the damage that the State Department was doing behind his back in trying to undo the
sure.
partition resolution and to continue with a trusteeship as opposed to ending the British mandate. A lot of skullduggery, and that continued. What's fascinating is the story of Clifford in Truman's office with Marshall, and the story of Rex Tillerson with President Trump and David Friedman playing the role of Clark Clifford, because what Trump told David is, David, you're going to be the guy who's going to have to argue with them. And so you're my man to bring out all the issues and to give all the answers. And I'm counting on you to perform that role, just like Truman selected Clark Clifford. And he did. And what's fascinating is some of the same silly arguments were made. Well, it's before the United Nations and they want to internationalize Jerusalem. So can you imagine Rex Tillerson? This issue was put to bed, by the way, as totally impractical, and nobody was really gonna die for it. So in 1951, there are internal State Department documents that basically say, come on, this is silly. Yeah, there are people in the UN who still talk about it, but no one's prepared to do anything about it. It's really a dead issue. What it's really about is making sure that the holy places are have free access, and the Jews are going to make that happen. I don't know if we can count the Arabs making that happen. And so they all recognized by 1951 that it was foolishness. Nevertheless, and this is a scene, it's like out of a movie. Rex Tillerson comes with a big briefing book, according to David Friedman. He turns and he starts talking about how Israel took over Jerusalem in 1996. Big flub. It's 1967. Immediately, he's embarrassed. He also talked about how the United States can't take a position about Jerusalem because of internationalization and the UN, which was poppycock. And so they never reached that issue because after the flub about 1996 versus 67, he got so embarrassed, he slammed his briefing book and said he was done. So plays out very.
I'd like to move to another very different type of question. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. There's been a long history of evangelical Christian support for Israel and even pre-Israel. During the Intifadas, for example, evangelical Christian groups visited Israel when a lot of Jewish groups were intimidated or fearful, whatever you want to call it. But they have a theological agenda which is not ours. On the one hand, we would like support from almost anyone who wants to support what the story is all about, and yet they have a religious agenda which is, to my way of thinking, very problematic for us. So what, and Farley can speak to that too. What's your feeling about all these evangelicals who are so supportive of Israel for their own theological purposes? How do we deal with that? How do we understand it? And again, I would also say as a historian, this phenomenon goes back, believe it or not, to the second quarter of the 19th century, where Mordechai Emanuel Noah, who's our first Jewish politician in this country, has things to say to missionaries and evangelicals back then. So what do you think about that question?
It goes back even further. It goes back to the Council of Nicaea and the Byzantines, who were supersessionists. They believed that they're the chosen people and we're out. It took a long time for the Catholic Church to finally reconcile itself and cite Romans for the proposition that the covenant is eternal and the Jews are still chosen. But the best resolution was Pastor Hagee, who's an amazing leader in the evangelical movement. And he's the one who formed CUFI, Christians United for Israel. And he says it so beautifully. He says, look, we all agree that the Jews are supposed to be in Israel. He goes, now, in the end of the days, somebody's going to have to make a theological adjustment. So it's recognizing that until then, we're all in this together, and we all believe it's not going to happen unless the Jews are in Israel. So we absolutely support the Jewish people being in Israel and succeeding there. And then when the Messiah comes, as J.J. Schachter once told me, remember to ask him, have you been here before? Is this the first time or the second time? So Pastor Hagee has a great sense of humor about it. We have differing views as to what will happen ultimately, but in terms of the progress of history in getting to that point, there's enough agreement that we can gracefully accept their support because they genuinely mean for us to succeed in Israel.
I think also
Farley?
to add I saw Pastor Hagee the morning of the embassy opening at a reception at breakfast that morning. He spoke at the embassy opening. He tells the story about starting Christians United for Israel. Of his first big event was with the synagogue in San Antonio that joined him for the event. And he said, we don't have any ulterior motives in doing this. They have, I think, close to 10 million members today and many millions of members of Christians United for Israel. And one of the main reasons why President Trump made his decision to recognize Jerusalem and move the embassy was the evangelical community gave President Trump 4 main issues that they wanted him to do. And one of the 4 was recognizing Jerusalem and moving the embassy. And so that was always on his agenda as a promise that he made, because President Trump only mentioned that he was going to recognize Jerusalem and move the embassy at the AIPAC conference in April before the November 2016 election. And again, when he met Prime Minister Netanyahu in September before the election, but he never said in any speeches, he never talked about it at all. And the only time, but now after that election, after he did it, it's become one of the biggest applause lines in non-Jewish crowds that he's done that. He's recognized Jerusalem and moved the embassy. And it's become a big thing, and the evangelical community is big supporters of it. And it wasn't always the case. Pastor Hagee really is the one that really moved the evangelical community to really make this a big issue. And it's become a huge issue in the evangelical community. And I think that, we have to, there's no reason not to be friends with them and recognize their support and not to worry about these ulterior issues, especially when even on the issue of anti-Semitism today, they've been speaking out about it and strong supporters of it. And we need allies in the United States for it. And I think that we should take Pastor Hagee at his word. I mean, he does a lot to support Israel and give to different charities in Israel as well. And when he spoke at the embassy opening, unlike Pastor Evers, he left Jesus' name out of his speech. And he is very careful on how he speaks and what he does at the Kufai conference every year in the summer. And I know Orthodox Jews who go there and how great he's been for the Jewish people.
Well, you can tell Reverend Hagee for me that in a sense he's tripping something that Mordechai Emanuel Noah said over 100 years ago, in which he said, we both believe at the end of the day, Jews will be back on their land and sovereign. You believe that will be the second coming. We believe will be the days of the Messiah. Let's work together towards that end and see what happens. I don't know if he ever read any of that stuff, but that's been part of Jewish interaction with evangelical groups going back to the 19th century. There's even even some evidence that Lord Balfour had a millenarian, had a second coming part of his orientation. And there is this phenomenon known as Christian Zionism, which is almost as long as Zionism itself. In the late 1890s, there was a memorial petition sent by 419 prominent Americans, including William McKinley and the Chief Justice of the United States, calling upon America to join with other countries to basically establish a Jewish presence in Palestine. They didn't know Theodore Herzl or vice versa. That was part of that history. So this is not new. I just want to say this is not new, but at the same time, one has to be very careful in understanding what their goals are. And as a Jewish group, we'll use them for our advantage. You excuse me for saying this in a very cynical way, because it's very important for the Jewish people. So let's turn. let's turn to the actual story itself. Okay, what's the untold backstory that's in this? How we are able to overcome, not you, but you and others overcome the opposition where you have this from all these administrations affirm this, but it doesn't happen. So
Well,
how
so
does it happen?
Farley was actually there, so
So I'll
Farley.
tell you.
Okay. Fine.
So I was living in Arizona at the time, and I had built a relationship with Senator Kyle's, then Congressman Kyle's office, and I had invited him to our synagogue to speak before the election when he became a senator in 1994. And he brought a staffer with him, Glenn Hammer, a Jewish staffer, to the event, and that's where I met Glenn. And after Senator Kyle won the election, became Senator Kyle, Glenn just said, I'm going to work for him, the Judiciary Committee, and he said one of his first things he wants to do is do legislation to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital and move the embassy. And they asked if I could be a liaison to his office and help advise him through the process as kind of representing the Jewish community. And that's what I did. And I kept all the faxes for the whole year as they went through the process of trying to get this bill passed against the opposition of the Clinton administration and the State Department. Dennis Ross was actually in the meeting with Senator Dole's office trying to stop the legislation from coming to effect, opposing the Jerusalem embassy legislation. And this was something that Senator Kyle had to do against his opposition. What he cleverly did was he got Bob Dole, who was the Senate Majority Leader and running for president, to support it, which was a rare thing for a Majority Leader to do in the Senate. And he ended up getting more and more people on board. Senator Joe Lieberman as being his main ally in the Democratic Party, and Daniel Patrick Monahan. And the legislation became the Dole, Monahan, Kyle Lieberman bill. And extraordinarily, it ended up having this, because of opposition from Senator Feinstein and Lautenberg, it ended up having this waiver provision in it, but it ended up passing 93-5, which no legislation during Clinton's 8 years as president came close to being overridden by a 93-5 vote in the Senate, 374-37 in the House. And so Clinton didn't want to veto it and have it overridden, so he let it become law without his signature. And then he decided to invoke the waiver provision, which really was only to apply to the moving of the embassy, not to the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital, but he applied it to both. It was a 6-month waiver, and he kept renewing it each time, which caught the senators and the congressmen off guard. 84 senators sent a letter to him, including that time Senator Kerry, sent a letter to him saying that you're not invoking the waiver properly, because it does only about the embassy, but you have to recognize Jerusalem as the capital. And this was, they expected that the embassy was going to be moved and recognized, and they didn't expect that Clinton would just continue to do it. It was supposed to be a narrow waiver, that there was a colloquy on the Senate floor that Senator Kyle and Bob Dole had to explain what the bill meant and what the national security waiver meant, that it was supposed to be very narrow. And that was ignored by Clinton, and that was ignored by George W. Bush. Even though he promised them in the campaign to move the embassy, it was ignored by President Obama, and only with President Trump did he go forward and not invoke the waiver and recognize Jerusalem as the capital.
This is an era where a lot of us feel that there's a shift in terms of Jewish power and powerlessness in dealing with government. What's your sense of where we stand right now with the present administration, its positions during this horrible war? How are we doing in terms of advocacy on the highest level? You know, the way you talk this evening, I want the group to know that both gentlemen write with such humility about their personal roles. But I'd like to know: can this law be undone? Can the embassy be moved with another administration coming in? What as you look ahead, what are your concerns, if any?
We actually wrote about it, because remember when Biden first came in, he wanted to do a consulate to the Palestinian Authority in Jerusalem. And it can't be done without Israel's consent. It violates Oslo, it violates the Vienna Convention, and we argued it violated the Jerusalem Embassy Act. And it's fascinating, because you remember there was a case which Farley also worked on, the Zivotowski case. Zivotowski was a couple who had a child in Jerusalem, and they wanted to record the child as being born in Israel. And the State Department refused to put on the passport born in Israel. They could have said born in Jerusalem. There were all kinds of possibilities, but they didn't want to say Israel. And he went all the way to the Supreme Court twice, first against Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, and then Kerry when he was Secretary of State. And they lost in court, but the language of the court in the majority opinion was very helpful, because what it said was, and indeed, had they had some of the knowledge that we had in this book, they might have made a little bit of a stronger case. But be that as it may, the court acknowledged that the decision on recognition was shared between Congress and the president. It wasn't just presidential authority, as the Department of Justice argued. And what happened then was the court was focused only on one fact. Did the president recognize Jerusalem? Now, I think, again, we could have been helpful because there's a lot of presidential recognition of Jerusalem, either directly or indirectly, including the Anglo-American Convention. But again, be that as it may, once the president recognized, the president then, the executive office, was then subject to law. So Jerusalem Embassy Act is law. The president could argue you're mixing in foreign affairs in an area that we share authority. And so you can't force me to recognize. But once the president recognized, no administration after that could violate the law, because then the law was fully, had the force of law under the US law. And so the waiver, when Trump didn't exercise the waiver, recognized undivided Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, that sealed the issue. And as we know, Biden in the end didn't move the embassy, didn't put in that little consulate for the PA. They did do something cute. They formed an office just for the PA, which is also very suspect legally, especially under the Vienna Convention, and also under Oslo II, which expressly prohibits that type of behavior without the consent of Israel. But there was no movement of the embassy, no new embassy. The law is the law now, and it would take an act of Congress and the president acting together to change it.
I think also to bring it up to what you've asked about the current administration,
Yeah.
part of what we discuss in the book is the fact that the State Department has been terrible throughout, except for under President Trump, in which you had, for the first time, Orthodox, pro-Israel Orthodox Jews, not just Orthodox Jews. There's been an Orthodox Jew or two that have not been supportive. They just followed the same view of the non-Jews and the non-Orthodox Jews. You had Orthodox Jews and David Friedman and Jason Greenblatt and Jared Kushner involved in U.S. policy towards Israel. And what you saw was the Abraham Accords, not just the recognition of Jerusalem, recognition of the Golan Heights. You saw the Abraham Accords. You saw all this amazing success. And I spoke to Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State, at one of our Israel Heritage Foundation events. And I said, since you saw the success of your policies, what about the State Department people below you? Do you think that any of them have changed their views because they all were following the other views? And he said, no, it needs to be cleaned, a clean house needs to be done. They haven't changed their views. And you see now with the Biden administration, they've gone back to the same failed policies before. No new nations added to the Abraham Accords. You see now a whole war in the Middle East that is likely would never have happened if President Trump was in power. And so you see all the same disastrous policies pushing for now a Palestinian state. And even though you have Jews and Anthony Blinken and other people, and you see the former Jews in the State Department, the Aaron David Miller, and the besides Dennis Ross and Martin Indyk and all these other people advocating the same failed policies as before. It's when you had people who are Orthodox Jews and pro-Israel, like a David Friedman and a Jason Greenblatt and Jared Kushner, that's when you saw a successful policy. and you saw the pro-Israel policies being enacted, and the State Department is still following their same failed ways.
That's very, very helpful. That's very. So there was a question from the audience. Is there any real diplomatic / political advantage of moving the embassy to Jerusalem, or is it more of a symbolic move by the Trump administration to do that? Do you have any comments on that particular?
David Friedman, we sat with David Friedman to reflect on this very issue. And David said it so beautifully. We normally talk about the verse from Isaiah about how you'll beat your swords into plowshares. But people ignore the verse that appears just before it, where it says, peace will emanate from Jerusalem. So his view was, and he was on the point, and Jason Greenblatt as well, is it was because of the U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as the undivided Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, moving the embassy there, that gave tangible evidence of U.S. support for Israel, and that bond could be used as the basis of attaching more people. It became like the nucleus in an atom that attracted all the electrons to come around it. And so the stronger that
It's intriguing. So you're linking the move to Jerusalem to the Abraham Accords?
Yes, and that's what David Friedman said. It was when they recognized that this bond was that strong and they saw the success achieved, they all wanted to attach themselves as well. And Netanyahu used a very interesting expression. He called it the circle of peace. What happened is everyone wanted to come into this orbit and experience the benefits. And it's now self-reinforcing, because as more states join and see that they're doing well as a result of this, and they're enjoying the benefits, it becomes enlightened self-interest to form a bond. And so it was that nucleus, and David couldn't have been clearer that it came out of that, the Abraham Accords. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. And think about it. If you're making a decision to hook your wagon, don't you want to hook your wagon to somebody who's powerful and loyal, as opposed to someone who tries to tout they're an honest broker? Do me a favor. Honest brokers don't make a living. The guys who know are loyal. Loyalty is not being so balanced. Loyalty is, we're in this together, and if you join us, I'll have the same relationship with you. That means something in the world. And so all of this dilettantism, where they're talking about virtue signaling and we're even-handed and all that, everyone understands that in the world is weakness. But when they see a real relationship that's loyal, where it's successful, those are the guys they want to hang with. And that was the source of the Abraham Accords.
So much for the great apprehension that the move to Jerusalem would spark all the Arab nations going against Israel. This has been absolutely the opposite. You're pointing to your colleague.
Yes, because tell them about the calls you got.
So when I was at the National Council on Israel, I was convinced. I wrote 4 op-eds before President Trump moved the embassy, just when he was, from the time he was elected till he did so. I wrote 4 op-eds telling him to move it, why it was the right thing to do, why it would be successful. And then when I told her I was the president of the National Council on Israel, and I organized a call to the White House, we're the only Jewish organization to do it at the time. And I said, President Trump cares about what Americans think. There's no one calling on the other side. We're just going to be the one side of Americans calling. And I had 2 people say to me when I was organizing the call, why are you doing this? You could jeopardize American lives and Jewish lives. And that in any ways, Trump's not going to do it. And I said, Trump is somebody who has the chutzpah that will ignore the threats. And he actually said, speaks very often about how these world leaders were calling him and threatening him and don't do it and telling him not to do it. And he actually told his secretary, eventually, just tell them all, I'll talk to them next week. And then he called them up the next week and said, I'm calling you back. And they said, what are you calling me about? He goes, about not to move the embassy. He goes, I already made that decision. And so what you saw was that, one of the things we put in the book is that the United States actually put an embassy in East Berlin under East German rule. There was one country in the world a U.S. ally, the best U.S. ally, that they were not putting embassy. It was really discrimination, anti-Semitic discrimination, that the embassy wasn't moved and it wasn't recognized Jerusalem as the capital. And yet we see from our book, we put in the Anglo-American Accords that recognized Jerusalem all the way back in the 1920s, and yet it wasn't done. And so it really was rectifying a historical wrong, and that President Trump did it. And when people said, oh, you're going to leave, all these lives are going to be lost, not one American life, not one Jewish life was lost because of the move of the embassy to Jerusalem. And instead, it led to the Abraham Accords and all this peace breaking out. And yet you almost hear from the Biden administration that they've been pushing Antony Blinken saying about opening a consulate for the Palestinian Authority in East Jerusalem, which would be a violation of the Jerusalem embassy. And why would you do such a thing? Their base is Ramallah. Why would you put it in East Jerusalem? It's trying to destroy the Jewish sovereignty over Jerusalem. It's an outrageous situation.
Well, we've been very privileged this evening on so many levels here. First, listen to people who were actors in this wonderful drama, but who write with passion, but also a high degree of literacy and objectivity. It's a book that should be read by everyone and serve as a document for future manifestations of Jewish influence, importance to the state of Israel. So I congratulate you on this effort, and I recommend this book very highly to everyone who's here tonight and also to your friends. The book is available on Amazon. It will soon be an audio book, if I'm not mistaken, and also Barnes & Noble and hopefully all such other venues. So we're very grateful for your time and to be back at Yeshiva University and to teach us, you know, not only to inspire us, but to teach us about the history of diplomatic initiatives in support of the state of Israel. And we hope you'll come back and give us some more insights as time goes on. So the book is called Because It's Just and Right, The Untold Backstory of the U.S. Recognition of Jerusalem as the Capital of Israel and Moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, Farley, Weiss, and Leonard Grunstein. Thank you very much. It's been a great evening, and we appreciate it's as one of the people here wrote, thank you so much. It is an amazing book, and I agree. So good evening, everybody.
I want to just add one thing because I forgot to put it earlier, but it's very important. The
Sure.
title starts with because it's just and right, because when people would go up to Senator Kyle and said, why are you pushing for this embassy? Why are you pushing for the U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as the capital? And you're not Jewish. And his response was, because it's just and right. And that's that response that he would say, that's what came up with the title of the book, Because It's Just and Right.
Well,
And
you should know that the chats are coming in. Wonderful, great book, great talk. Thanks for doing it. And my thanks as well. And
Thank you.
we look forward to more evenings like this with the library group. And I'm grateful for the opportunity of being your moderator. So Laila Tov, everybody, have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
All
so
the
much.
best.